Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the Western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne.
Chapter 27, Passepartout gets a quick lesson in Mormon history while traveling at 20 miles an hour. During the night of December 5th, the train traveled southeast for about 50 miles, then turned northeast, heading toward the Great Salt Lake. Around 9 o'clock, Passepartout stepped out onto the platform to get some fresh air. The weather was cold, the sky was gray, but it wasn't snowing. The sun, looking huge and ring-like through the mist, caught his attention. Amused, he started to calculate its value in pounds when he was interrupted by a strange-looking man who appeared on the platform. This man, who had boarded the train at Elko, was tall and dark, with a black mustache. He wore black stockings, a black silk hat, a black waistcoat, black trousers, a white cravat, and skin gloves. He looked almost like a clergyman. Moving from one end of the train to the other, he attached a handwritten notice to the door of each car. Curious, Passepartout walked over and read one of the notices. It announced that Elder William Hitch, a Mormon missionary, would be giving a lecture on Mormonism in car number 117 from 11 to 12 o'clock. He invited anyone interested in learning about the Latter-day Saints religion to attend. I'll go, Passepartout thought. The only thing he knew about Mormonism was its practice of polygamy, or having multiple wives. Word quickly spread through the train, which held about 100 passengers. About 30 people, intrigued by the announcement, gathered in car number 117. Passepartout took a seat near the front. Neither Mr. Fogg nor Fix decided to join. At 11 o'clock, Elder William Hitch stood up and in an irritated tone, as if he'd already been arguing with someone. His frustration likely came from the tough treatment the Mormons were currently facing. The U.S. government had recently struggled but finally succeeded in taking control of Utah and making the independent-minded followers there obey federal laws. Elder Hitch, as it turned out, was trying to make converts right on the train. Then, speaking loudly and gesturing often for emphasis, Elder Hitch recounted the history of the Mormons. Some passengers, uninterested in the elder's tale, left the train car. Undeterred, Hitch continued, describing how Smith, alongside his father, brothers, and a few followers, founded the Church of the Latter-day Saints. The movement grew rapidly, attracting members from the United States, England, Norway, Sweden, and Germany, including skilled artisans and professionals. Hitch spoke of the community's establishment in Ohio, where they built a temple costing $200,000 and a town called Kirtland. The story grew tedious for many, and the crowd dwindled to about 20 passengers. Soon he was speaking to just one listener, Passepartout. Fixing his eyes on Passepartout, he asked, "Brother, will you not join us and pitch your tent under our flag?" "No," Passepartout replied firmly, leaving Hitch to preach an empty car. By this time, the train had reached the northwest border of the Great Salt Lake. The passengers gazed out at the vast expanse of what's also called the Dead Sea. Framed by towering cliffs, the salt-encrusted waters shimmered under the midday sun. The Salt Lake, spanning 17 miles in length and 30 miles in width, is perched nearly 4,000 feet above sea level.
Unlike the Dead Sea in the Middle East, which lies far below sea level, its waters are so saline that the fish cannot survive, quickly perishing after entering from rivers like the Jordan or Weber. The surrounding land, largely farmed by Mormons, boasted wheat fields, corn crops, and livestock pens during the warmer months. But now the fields were dusted with snow. The train stopped at Ogden at 2 p.m., allowing Mr. Fogg's group 6 hours to explore Salt Lake City. The city, laid out in precise squares, reflected the Anglo-Saxon penchant for symmetry. They wandered past blue brick houses with verandas, gardens, and the prophet's mansion before reaching the temple's vicinity, where the streets were livelier. Passepartout was struck by the sight of women living under polygamy, which he viewed with a mix of pity and alarm. He couldn't imagine the burden of leading so many wives to both earthly and heavenly happiness. Worse, he felt the women's glances were unnervingly fixed on him, as if considering him for such a role. Relieved, he left the city at 4 to rejoin his group. As the train prepared to depart, shouts of "Stop" rang out. A breathless man, clearly a Mormon, leapt onto the moving train. Passepartout, intrigued, struck up a conversation and learned that the man had fled after a domestic dispute. Passepartout asked, "How many wives do you have?" "One," the man groaned, raising his arms in frustration, "and one is enough." Chapter 28. Passepartout fails to convince anyone to be reasonable. As the train departed Great Salt Lake at Ogden, it traveled north for an hour, reaching the Weber River after covering nearly 900 miles from San Francisco. From there, it turned eastward toward the rugged Wasatch Mountains. This region, lying between the Wasatch Range and the Rocky Mountains, presented some of the toughest challenges to American engineers during the construction of the railway. To overcome these obstacles, the government provided subsidies of $48,000 per mile, triple the amount allocated for the plains. Rather than carving directly through the rocks, the engineers skillfully circumvented them, constructing only one tunnel, 14,000 feet long, to access the Great Basin. Passepartout grew increasingly restless as the journey progressed, while Fix, eager to leave this challenging terrain, seemed even more anxious than Phileas Fogg to avoid delays and accidents and make it to England. At 10 p.m., the train arrived at Fort Bridger Station and 20 minutes later entered Wyoming Territory, following Bitter Creek Valley. On December 7th, they paused briefly at Green River Station. Overnight snow had mixed with rain, half melting and sparing the train from disruptions. However, the poor weather irritated Passepartout, who worried the snow might clog the train's wheels and jeopardize Fogg's carefully timed journey. "What a foolish idea," Passepartout muttered to himself. "Why did my master choose to travel in winter? Waiting for better weather would have improved his odds." While Passepartout worried about the weather, Aouda grew anxious for a different reason. Among the passengers who disembarked at Green River to stretch their legs, she spotted Colonel Stamp Proctor, the man who had insulted Phileas Fogg back in San Francisco. Alarmed, she pulled back from the window, determined to avoid being recognized. Aouda felt a growing attachment to Fogg, who, despite his reserved demeanor, showed her unwavering kindness and dedication. She couldn't fully grasp the depth of her feelings, which she labeled gratitude, but which, as she was unaware, were far more profound. Her heart sank at the sight of Proctor, knowing that Fogg had vowed to confront him one day. It was clear Proctor's presence was a coincidence, but it was crucial that Fogg did not notice him. When Fogg dozed off, Aouda confided in Fix and Passepartout about what she had seen. "Proctor is on this train," Fix exclaimed. "Don't worry, madam. Before he deals with Mr. Fogg, he'll have to answer to me. I was the one he insulted more." "And me," added Passepartout. "Colonel or not, I'll handle him." "Mr. Fix," Aouda interjected, "Mr. Fogg won't let anyone fight his battles. He said he would return to America for this man. If he sees Proctor now, a confrontation is inevitable, with who knows what consequences. We must ensure he doesn't notice him." "You're absolutely right," Fix agreed. "A fight would be disastrous. Win or lose, Mr. Fogg would be delayed." "Exactly," Passepartout chimed in, "and that would hand victory to those gentlemen at the Reform Club. In 4 days we'll be in New York. If we can keep my master in this carriage until then, he won't have a chance encounter with that blasted American." The discussion ended as Fogg woke up and gazed out the window. Later, Passepartout leaned toward Fix and whispered, "Would you really fight for him?" Fix replied firmly, "I'd do whatever it takes to get him back to Europe alive." Passepartout shivered slightly at Fix's tone, but remained steadfast in his trust in Fogg. Could Mr. Fogg be kept in the car to avoid meeting the colonel? It seemed an easy task, given his naturally sedentary habits and lack of curiosity. The detective appeared to have a plan. After a moment, he remarked, "These hours on the train are dragging, sir." "They are," Mr. Fogg replied, "but they pass." "You used to play whilst on the steamers," Fix continued. "Yes, but that would be difficult here. No cards, no partners." Cards are sold on all American trains, and if Madam plays, I do, Ayuda said quickly. It's part of an English education. And I can hold my own, Fix added. With 3 of us, we only need an extra. As you wish, Mr. Fogg agreed, clearly pleased to resume his favorite pastime even on a train. Passepartout fetched cards, counters, and a cloth-covered shelf. The game began, and Ayuda's skill drew compliments from Mr. Fox. Fix, an expert, matched Fogg's abilities well. Perfect, thought Passepartout. He won't leave his seat now. By 11 a.m., the train reached Bridger Pass, 7,524 feet above sea level, one of the highest points on the route through the Rockies. After covering 200 miles, they emerged onto vast plains stretching toward the Atlantic, where streams feeding the North Platte River became visible. The northern and eastern horizons were framed by the sweeping curves of the southern Rockies, dominated by Laramie Peak. To the south, smaller ridges extended toward the Arkansas River's source. Around 12:30 p.m., the travelers glimpsed Fort Halleck briefly before fully crossing the Rockies. The snow had stopped, and crisp, cold air replaced the storm. Large birds, startled by the train, soared into the distance, but no wild animals roamed the barren plains. After a comfortable onboard breakfast, the group returned to their game. Suddenly, a shrill whistle broke the calm, and the train screeched to a halt. Passepartout peeked outside but saw no station or obvious cause for the delay. Ayuda and Fix exchanged worried glances, fearing Mr. Fogg might step out. Instead, he calmly said, "Passepartout, find out what's going on." Passepartout hurried outside, joining a group of 30 or 40 passengers, including Colonel Stamp Proctor. The train had stopped at a red signal blocking the track. The engineer, conductor, and a signalman sent ahead from Medicine Bow were in heated discussion. "The bridge at Medicine Bow is unstable," the signalman explained. "It can't support the train's weight." The bridge, a suspension structure spanning rapids about a mile from their current location, was in dire condition. According to the signalman, several of its iron cables had snapped, making it too dangerous to cross. His report was not exaggerated. Prudent caution, rare among Americans, was warranted this time. Passepartout, unwilling to alarm his master, listened silently, his teeth clenched and his body frozen. "Well," exclaimed Colonel Proctor, "we're not going to sit here and freeze, are we?" "We've sent a telegram to Omaha for another train," replied the conductor, "but won't arrive for at least 6 hours. 6 hours, Passepartout blurted out. "Yes, and it would take just as long to reach Medicine Bow on foot," the conductor added. "But it's only a mile," protested one passenger. "True, but the river is between us and the town." "Can't we use a boat to cross?" asked the colonel. "That's impossible. The creek has swollen from the rain, turning it into rapids. To find a safe ford, we'd need to take a 10-mile detour to the north." The colonel burst out with a string of curses aimed at the railway company, and Passepartout, fuming with frustration, considered joining it. This was a problem even his master's wealth couldn't solve. Passepartout decided he had no choice but to inform Mr. Fogg. As he reluctantly turned toward the train, the engineer, a true Yankee named Forster, spoke up. "Gentlemen, there might be a way to get across," he said. "On the bridge?" someone asked. "With the train," another added. "Yes," said Forster confidently. "If we go at full speed, we might make it." Passepartout stopped, stunned. The passengers, initially hesitant, quickly warmed to the idea, with Colonel Proctor leading the charge. "We got a 50-50 chance," someone said. "More like 80 or 90, another added. Passepartout was skeptical. This is madness, he thought, but the crowd's enthusiasm drowned out his concerns. "Nonsense," snapped an American. "The engineer knows what he's doing." But Colonel Proctor interrupted. "Full speed ahead," he roared. Defeated, Passepartout boarded the train, muttering to himself that crossing on foot would have been safer. His caution went unheard amid the passengers' excitement. The train reversed nearly a mile, then surged forward at terrifying speed. The locomotive screeched, pistons pumping furiously. The train seemed to hover over the rails, and in a blinding flash it crossed the bridge. No one had time to see the structure as they soared over it. When the train finally stopped, 5 miles beyond the station, they heard a distant crash. The bridge had collapsed into the rapids below.